Zach, we are back for part 2 of what we would trade every single old wide receiver for. Following up on part 1, we're getting into a bunch more wide receivers today that are all over the age of 28. Some of these guys, maybe we're just trying to get out while they're getting still good, trying to get any value we can. Maybe we're more interested in some of these players on having them on our roster for a competitive push than selling them. But either which way, we're going to highlight what it would cost to sell them, maybe what it would cost to buy them, and we hope you enjoy every second of it. If you do, leave a like on the video, comment down below what you're selling some of these wideouts for. What have you gotten selling some of these wideouts? What have you bought some of these wideouts for? We want to hear all about it, and we want to hear from you over in our Patreon Discord. Head on over to patreon.com/Dynasty Rewind to get in there for a free 7-day trial and see what we can do for your Dynasty rosters. But Zach, with all that said, all the promo in the books, let's get to the content that people came for. Number 1 on the list today, Mike Evans. He's 30. He will be 31 in August. Are you buying, selling, holding, avoiding? What are you selling him for? What are you buying him for? Whatever the case is, tell me what you got on Mike Evans.
Eventually, Father Time will affect Mike Evans. Well, we've been saying that for 2-3 years now, right? It straight up hasn't happened. The prevailing thought makes me very interested in acquiring Evans in the right spots, Bob. He accounted for 24.5% or 24.5%, I should say, 24.5% of the target share for Tampa Bay last year. And just as we noted in the last video with Chris Godwin, they didn't really add a whole lot of competition to this wide receiver room. They did bring in Jalen McMillan, who I think is more competition for Trey Palmer than he is Mike Evans and Chris Godwin. Who knows how that looks down the road? So, they bring Baker Mayfield back. The gang's back together again, minus Dave Canales. We already talked about that in the Chris Godwin video in part 1. It's also very easy to sit here and poke holes and say, hey, Mike Evans not going to get 13 touchdowns again like he did last season. But he's done it 3 of the past 4 seasons with 2 different quarterbacks. So you can't really poke holes in that. Like, it's one thing if it was a one-off, but when it happens 3 of the past 4 years with 2 different quarterbacks, I feel safe in saying he's going to get 8 to 10 at the minimum. So look, as a matter of fact, 12% of Mike Evans' career receptions, Bob, have been touchdowns, which is insane over a 10-year career. I think he's easily penciled in as a wide receiver 2 with the ceiling of hitting a wide receiver 1 as he did last year, as he's done a couple times the past few years. I do have a few shares of Mike Evans. It's not, and it hasn't been expensive to acquire him for a few years now because of the first sentence I uttered coming into this video. This is a player that I want to acquire, and I want to ride into the sunset and be okay with the production that I get and never feel bad about it. Am I sitting here saying he's going to be wide receiver 1? No, but I feel safe in saying he's going to be somewhere top 15, top 20 with the ceiling of being top 10, top 8 wide receiver. I think a good deal here in acquiring Mike Evans or trading for Mike Evans is offering a future second-round pick. Don't care what year, don't care whose pick it is. Or if they don't want a draft pick, I'd feel comfortable in offering Ramondre Stevenson for Mike Evans. I know Stevenson just got the 4-year contract. I don't really care. It's just like I've never been in love with Ramondre Stevenson. It's not a player. I don't think I have any shares unless I've inherited them on orphan teams. So if I can move Ramondre Stevenson and get 1 to 2 years of potential high ceiling opportunity at the wide receiver position in what I think is a low cost move, I'd like to do that. So whether it's a second round pick, whether it's Ramondre Stevenson, this is a player I'm not really looking to sell. I have no spots where I've sold Mike Evans unless I am not a competitive team. If I'm a competitive team, this is a player I actually really want at the price that it costs to acquire him, because I just see no reason why he couldn't replicate the production of last year or be a little bit better. Just a player I'd like to have on my rosters, not someone I actually want to sell, but somebody I'd actually like to buy. So what do you feel about that, Bob?
I'm with you. I think Mike Evans is a better buy than a sell, or a better hold than a sell. Either which way, if you are looking to sell, would you take a Trey Benson, a Josh Jacobs, a Keon Coleman, Baker Mayfield in a super flex league? Would you take Rashee Rice? Are any of these guys tickling your fancy, Zach, when it comes to getting Mike Evans off your roster? Would you accept any of those deals? Or would you rather have somebody like Christian Kirk and maybe you get a third on top for Mike Evans?
The only one that got me remotely excited was the Trey Benson one. just because
Okay.
I do think he's the starting running back, whether it's later this season or next year or 2 years from now, whatever it is. I see that opportunity there for him in what's looking like a very good offense. So that one I would be interested in doing. It would make me hurt inside because I actually do like having Mike Evans, but I'd rather have Mike Evans over almost anyone else you listed there. There's not a lot of dynasty players that I want to have when they retire. And I think I'd be happy having Mike Evans retire on my team.
Somebody else who maybe you want to have on your roster while he retires, maybe not. Cooper Kupp, 31 years young. Another guy might be more of a hold or a buy than a sell because I don't think you're getting great value. He's a tough sell right now. The last 2 seasons, he's missed significant time. So you're not getting great value compared to the points he can possibly put in your lineup. But like I just said, he's missed time the last 2 seasons. And value-wise, he's kind of also in no man's land with a bunch of other older wide receivers that we're not trying to, pivot off of these guys to other ones. We want to look at external values or different values outside of the position, whatever the case is. So if I'm looking for points in 2024, it always comes down to what I'm trying to do. Do I want points or I just want to get out for value, whatever the case is? If I'm looking for points in 2024, a tier down move I love to make would be to Deontay Johnson, somebody who I think is primed to take over that Carolina receiver room. Not that Carolina receiver room might be that fruitful for value, but either way, I think this is a deal where you can send a third with Kupp and get a second on top of Deontay Johnson and get younger at a position, which is always a benefit, and you improve a pick as well. So I lose some upside in the deal, but I think I get a better floor, somebody who hasn't had the same injury concerns over the course of his career, especially specifically the last 2 years like Kupp has. So I think this is one I get younger, I get a better pick. If you're selling aging vets, I don't know if you can really get that much better of a deal than that, where you improve 2 assets in 2 different ways. That's what I look to do moving Kupp. I know that's kind of short and sweet, but I, touched on it when we talked about the top 12 wide receivers in Puka Nacua. This is the Puka Nacua show featuring guest appearances with Cooper Kupp. And I think, while I can have this rosy colored image for what I think Cooper Kupp can be this year once receivers age, and Cooper Kupp has had a couple, scrapes over the course of his career, has had an ACL injury, had 2 injuries over the past 2 years that were pretty significant. The wheels don't usually get screwed back under the bus. Once they start falling off, they fall off, and the receiver tends to fall off with it. So I'm definitely a little bit more pessimistic about Cooper Kupp, but selling at his current value might not be the best move unless you can pivot, like I said, to Deontay Johnson in this case. Still looking for points, tearing down to Deontay Johnson. Zach, what are your thoughts on this one? What are your thoughts on Kupp? Do you have rose-colored lenses on for him more than I do, or are you pessimistic about him as well?
I'm not pessimistic, but I wouldn't say I have rose-colored glasses. I think Cooper Kupp, as long as he's healthy, can have a good season. Probably not the ceiling that he had a couple years ago. Like Puka Nacua is there, Kyron Williams is there, Blake Corum is there. They've made improvements to the overall talent on that. It's not like it's Van Jefferson after Cooper Kupp anymore. Like
Sure.
there are other options there. They've added a couple of tight ends. They signed Colby Parkinson out of free agency. They drafted Dennis Allen 2 years ago, who had a good end of the season last year. Like there are still things that are better there than there was around Cooper Kupp a couple of years ago. So I think Cooper Kupp, wide receiver 15, wide receiver 20, maybe wide receiver 10, who knows, depending on how that offense circulates. But the name that you brought up, Deontay Johnson, I would be so happy to pivot off Cooper Kupp and get Deontay Johnson plus anything. I am a huge Deontay Johnson fan ever since he moved on to Carolina. I'm going to give you a stat here from ESPN Analytics.
Love it.
Since 2021, Deontay Johnson ranks first in the league in open score, which measures a wide receiver's likelihood to complete a catch conditional on if he were targeted. So what we're saying there is he's not being targeted enough. He's also not getting good targets because let's look at his quarterback play the last 2 seasons. Other wide receivers in that category real quick: Antonio Brown, Justin Jefferson, Tyreek Hill, Stephon Diggs. Deontay Johnson is number 1 in that category. So I'm a huge Deontay Johnson fan. If I could pivot off of any of the wide receivers that we've spoken about in this video to Deontay Johnson plus, I'd be ecstatic about it. So you got my sweet spot. You found my kryptonite.
And moving on to another wide receiver who I still like a good bit this year. The quarterback questions are for sure there. But talking about Amari Cooper, 30 years old at this point, What do you got on Amari Cooper, Zach? Buying, selling, holding. What cost you thinking for Amari Cooper?
Yeah, this is a player like we talked about with Stephon Diggs. I just want to try to get off my roster before it's too late. And I say that acknowledging that he could have a decent season. He was wide receiver 18 last year. But if you take away 1 week from Amari Cooper's season last year, which, by the way, that 1 week he had Joe Flacco as his quarterback, and you could even extrapolate this to the 2 weeks because he had a 20-point week and then a 50-point week back-to-back with Joe Flacco as his quarterback. He's a wide receiver 3, like wide receiver 33 or 34. I made this metaphor earlier. I could see Amari Cooper having a very Julio Jones ending to his career. I don't want to be left with that on my team. I'm okay with that happening with Mike Evans type of production, but not borderline wide receiver 2 or 3 type of production. So I'd like to get him off my roster. And I'm saying that acknowledging that could be a top 15, top 20 wide receiver, but there's just so much out of Amari Cooper's control that's affecting that. And that being Deshaun Watson, who hasn't been a competent quarterback since before COVID was
2020.
Yeah. Yeah. So in moving Amari Cooper, can I get a future second and third round pick? Or better yet, can I get one of my favorite rookie wide receivers? Can I get Jermaine Burton and a 25 third? Burton is a player, as you know, Bob, I'm very excited about, and someone that I think the Dynasty community very much undervalues. So I'd be happy. And I'm probably taking a pretty good production hit in 1 year, and I'm okay with that because I'm playing the long game here.
I honestly think you could probably get a 25 second with Burton in most deals, because I do think, not that I love the deal because I'm just not as in on Burton. I get the thought on him and everything, but I just think if you get a 25 second with Burton, that kind of covers you. And I think that covers you value wise. You're getting a second at least. You get some upside with Burton. Maybe he turns into something or a piece you can flip for more later. Who knows either which way. So I don't hate that deal. And I don't hate the points you brought up with Amari Cooper. I have, I like to think that, Deshaun Watson's going to get his poop together this year and figure it out and be back to being a competent quarterback. Like you said, hasn't been since 2020. I know those are maybe long odds at this point, but he has a competent head coach that has been able to put enough together with his offense with a myriad of quarterbacks that are not that great anymore, between Joe Flacco being the poster child at this point, but just not a lot of great actual quarterbacks there, remaining competent with that team. And maybe that's been a good bit of the defense either which way. If Watson can put it back together, I think that is the key. If Watson can put together a top 15 quarterback season, I think Cooper is right up there with a top 20 wide receiver season. I don't think that's outlandish to say at all. So I definitely agree overall with your sentiment. I think it's just safer to get out while the value is still pretty good. And I think you can get pretty decent value for Amari Cooper as well. So I think at this point I'm in agreement, maybe changing up what I'm all getting in return, but definitely have concerns with Amari Cooper, but I could also see it break right. And again, maybe rose-colored lenses, who knows? But I like Amari Cooper. I like the talent a good bit. We'll see what happens. We'll also have to see what happens with this next wide receiver. Calvin Ridley, 29, will be 30 by year's end, and I certainly don't want to buy him. There is no chance I want to buy in on this offense. Outside of Tony Pollard, he's the only piece I feel good about buying in on because I feel like the value is probably the best for Tony Pollard because he's barely valued as a top 30 running back, if even a top 30 running back. Calvin Ridley, I could definitely see an argument for, but I'm just not interested. But on the flip side of that, selling right now isn't super easy either. I have questions with this offense, primarily at quarterback with Will Levis, and definitely what Ridley's role looks like in this offense. I can't imagine him being the wide receiver 1 while DeAndre Hopkins is still there. And right off the rip at that point, that puts question marks in my mind. So if you have him, probably a hold. If you don't have him, probably an avoid. If you're trying to stick at wide receiver, looking at some costs here and pivot off Ridley and you want to add some upside, to me, that's Hollywood Brown, somebody who has maintained a good target share over the last few years of his career. Obviously has had injury concerns up and down the wazoo, but is there anybody that has more upside at his value, given his quarterback situation and the team situation? That offense is going to be good. Now, this wide receiver room has definitely upgraded over this last year. Adding Rashee Rice, we don't know what's going on with that suspension issue. If there's going to be one, what it's going to be, we don't know. Xavier Worthy, an upgrade over what they've had, and Marquise Brown is an upgrade over what they've had over the last couple of years. And then obviously you still have Travis Kelce there. If Hollywood Brown is getting anywhere near the target share he's had over the past couple years and can stay healthy. I mean, good Lord, the upside's the moon at this point. I mean, it's top 10 wide receiver numbers if he's going to get the same target share and productivity that comes from being Patrick Mahomes' wide receiver that is actually good. That's your high upside kind of play, but if you want some more security, you could make a pivot to other older running backs like we've talked about previously, Alvin Kamara, Joe Mixon. It's also likely those guys net you more points at a crucial position, depending on league format. Obviously different formatting and scoring comes into play for sure, but running backs more valuable, possibly more points, and a lot less volatility as even though they're older running backs, they're still less volatile than Hollywood Brown at this point. So that's where I'm at. Those are some guys I'd be looking to get if I'm moving off of Calvin Ridley. Zach, I'd love to hear your thoughts.
Yeah, I'm with you, man. Not a player I have any shares of unless I inherited a team, and even then, I've probably made the move of getting him off. I think everyone associates Calvin Ridley with the Atlanta Falcons production, and
Sure.
I just don't know how realistic that level of production is. I'm not saying he can't be a competent fantasy player, somebody you can plug in your starting lineup and hope for 8 to 10 points every week. I think he's still that, but I don't think he is what everyone associates him with, which is what he was a few years ago before the season-long suspension. If I can pivot off of Calvin Ridley to Hollywood Brown, man, I would feel so good about that for every reason. Like, there's just nothing I can add on to that. I think Hollywood Brown is obviously the Chiefs' primary or secondary wide receiver target in that passing game. And then in a year or so, he's going to look to capitalize on whatever success he potentially has this year into a decent contract. Like, he is on a prove-it deal right now, trying to get himself paid, as we are seeing wide receivers get buku bucks on the open market. So I would absolutely love that, because I know that Calvin really did just get paid. I'm just not a huge believer in that offense. I don't know what it looks like with Will Levis and Brian Callahan. There's just so much going on. We're going to talk about another player on this team. I agree with you. Everything you said, I don't really have anything else to add to make this different. I would like to pivot off Calvin Ridley for almost anything at this point.
Talk about a player, Terry McLaurin, currently 28, will be 29 at the start of the season in September. Looking to buy, looking to sell. What are your thoughts? What are your costs on Terry McLaurin, Zach?
This is probably Terry McLaurin's best opportunity to fulfill the prophecy we've always proclaimed Terry McLaurin to be. The fantasy community has always had Terry McLaurin like God tier status on the wide receiver list. And I know early on in his career, he was successful given his situation. However, he's never put it together, and I don't think it's entirely his fault. But you start to use McLaurin as a verb, right? Like, oh, I hope that Garrett Wilson doesn't get McLaurin, as we used to do DJ Moore a few years ago, right? Like, sure. That's the new verb in the fantasy community. But here's the situation. Cliff Kingsbury, offensive coordinator. Jayden Daniels, probably the best quarterback he's ever played with at Washington. They might be the best tandem that he's ever had. So if I can buy Terry McLaurin at the proper price, I would like to. If I have him, I'd rather hold than sell unless I can upgrade to a better wide receiver. And when I say better wide receiver, I'm thinking of a better wide receiver than what I think he can be with Jayden Daniels and Cliff Kingsbury, because I do think this is, again, the best opportunity he's ever had. If I could buy for a 25-second, I think I would. One trade that did interest me, however, when I looked at, I think it was Dynasty Calc or DLF, a trade that seems pretty even is moving Terry McLaurin and acquiring Derrick Henry. Derrick Henry, I'd love to have on my squad for 1 or 2 years, because I think he's the alpha, the primo running back there in Baltimore, the best place to be a running back. And again, I don't, while I'm projecting McLaurin to finally be somewhat fantasy relevant, we very much could disappoint on that again. And I just don't see a situation that Derrick Henry just completely flops being the running back 1 in Baltimore.
Let's talk a little bit about, you want to move off McLaurin, and if you're going to do that, you're going to try to sell into a better wide receiver. And I'm trying to look at some names here, and a name that sticks out, a name we've talked about already, Mike Evans. I know we don't want to necessarily tear down to other wideouts or move to other wideouts. We want to do something different, but I think that's probably somebody in the vein of what you're looking for, moving off Terry McLaurin. And Is it a second? Is it a third to get to Mike Evans? I'd be curious to know what that would look like for you. Otherwise, it's a tough road because it's kind of, you go from T. Higgins land, Jackson Smith and Jigba land, and these rookie wideouts and Brian Thomas Jr., Lad McConkey, Xavier Worthy. And then you get into these old bucks, the Mike Evans of the world, the Deebo Samuels of the world. So it's kind of like a harsh cliff. Maybe a Christian Kirk is, just above Terry McLaurin in most rankings. So it's not like that much of an improvement. So if you are selling Terry McLaurin, like what are you interested in moving up to really?
I'd want to pivot to an obvious upgrade. And I'm talking like the obvious guys, the Chris Olave, the Drake London. I'd like a much better, and I would pay up for that because while I do think maybe Terry McLaurin has a good season or 2 good seasons in Washington, he's 28, he's going to be 29, and he has never realized that potential that we've talked about. So if I could upgrade to a much more consistent or a younger and consistent wide receiver, I'd like to do that.
Moving on to the last one, then I got for you in part 2 of moving off of old wideouts. What would we look to get? DeAndre Hopkins, 32 years of age. Very similar conversation to what we had with Keenan Allen in part 1. The second oldest wide receiver, questionable quarterback, except this one is a second-round quarterback. Hit rates are not as good as they are with first-round quarterbacks. Granted, kind of all quarterback hit rates are all over the place. So am I going to rule out DeAndre Hopkins having a solid season? Absolutely not. But we know the cliff is coming fast. He's 32 years old. He's somewhat on that borrowed time metric if you want to rule it that way. But I'm willing to leave what points remain on the table on my team unless I'm getting a decent enough offer. Like I said, when we were talking about Calvin Ridley, DeAndre Hopkins is the number 1 wide receiver on this team for me until he is not. Until I see that, I can't project that Calvin Ridley is going to go and dominate target share over DeAndre Hopkins unless that decline is here upon us, whatever the case is. But your best bet might be to stay old and actually make your pivot to a running back like Raheem Mostert. Nate and I talked about Raheem Mostert being probably one of the best running back buys right now, a guy you can buy at the cost of DeAndre Hopkins, but also apparently a completed trade over on Dynasty Daddy, Courtland Sutton for Raheem Mostert. And what in the world, why would you want to sell Raheem Mostert for Courtland Sutton, the middest of the mid wide receivers? I don't know what we're thinking there, but Raheem Mostert, a running back capable of elite production given his skill set and scheme. But if you want to get a little younger at running back, lose the upside, but build some depth, Devin Singletary might be the pick. There's another one we talked about in the past, running back backfield monopolies. Be pretty cheap to add the rest of that backfield to really shore yourself up in that backfield. Not that I necessarily think it's an awesome backfield to have, but if you're just looking for some depth, it's an easy backfield to get a hold of. This option also holds a little less risk, but if you're not looking for points, your best bet, in my opinion, is to hope for a second-round pick in 26 or 2027, or maybe you could make a pivot to Ben Sinnott with little added investment, if any. Maybe you're throwing a third any year, a fourth any year. I think you can do that depending on the team. There's still a lot of people out there that are a little low on Ben Sinnott, which is fine by me. I've loved getting him in as many drafts as I can, as many drafts I have picks in. So that's something else I'd be looking. DeAndre Hopkins, a little fluid with what you can do with him, but depending on what you want to do, there's always some options. Talking DeAndre Hopkins, Zach, what are your thoughts? DeAndre Hopkins, selling costs, getting prices, whatever the case is.
This is a tough one. If you could get Devin Singletary or if you could get Raheem Mostert, I mean, good on you. I don't know, man. You got to find somebody who's not paying attention.
I mean,
oh, man, like DeAndre Hopkins, wide receiver 22 last year, and it doesn't even feel like it, right? I don't know, man. It's 2 rough seasons before that. Had a nice season last year, being the only option in that offense outside of Derrick Henry whenever they decided to pass the ball. And you do that thing, right? Like you can take away that one really dominant week that he had. I think week eight, where he had 34 fantasy points.
With Levis.
Yeah, 4 for 128 and 3, which is not a lot of volume. It's just incredibly efficient. You take that away, and he's probably wide receiver 30 to 32 on the season. Sure. So can you get what can you realistically get for DeAndre Hopkins at this point? I'm gonna be honest with you, a 3rd round pick, maybe. You have to find the owner that's like not either really likes DeAndre Hopkins, is a Tennessee Titans fan, or is just not paying attention to the dynasty landscape right now. Because if you could turn DeAndre Hopkins into a Raheem Mostert or a Devin Singletary, that's a phenomenal job by you. Like, you deserve a gold star, your name on a plaque, and your name on the Dynasty Rewind Hall of Fame. Because this is a dying asset if I've ever seen one. Aging wide receiver on a bad team. Like, there is a world where he has a wide receiver 2 season, but like, we got to start being real with ourselves. Not all these guys are going to succeed. So one or two of these wide receivers on this list is going to go off that cliff this year. And my first pick would be DeAndre Hopkins.
I don't hate it. Looking at some completed trades over at Dynasty Daddy right now in the last week. DeAndre Hopkins for Josh Downs. DeAndre Hopkins for Jerry Jeudy. DeAndre Hopkins for a second, for a second, for a second, for a second, for a third.
Wow.
For a second, for another second. Marvin Mims, kind of boring, but whatever. 24 second. So rookie drafts that haven't happened yet. A 24 third. Adding Rondale Moore to get to Najee Harris. So there's still a lot of rose-colored lenses out there, I think, for DeAndre Hopkins. So I think, hey, if you got him and you're pessimistic, I think going after those values, there's no harm in that. There's no shame in that. Because, it still seems like he's moving around for pieces. So take your shots, get a second-round pick, trade that second-round pick for something else. I think and Raheem Mostert is definitely valued less than a second-round pick from everything I've seen completed trades-wise, which is silliness. But, hey, it is what it is. Take the value of the age while you can. And like this video while you can. So leave a like if you enjoyed. Comment down below what you're selling some of these wide receivers for. Let us know down in the comments. We want to hear from you what you're selling them for, what you're buying them for. What are some completed trades you've made selling these guys? And we want to hear from you over in the Patreon Discord. Heading over to patreon.com/Dynasty Rewind. Get in that Discord server for a free 7-day trial and see what we can do to build up that Dynasty roster of yours. But with all that said, Zach and I are going to get the heck on out of here. We will see you in the next one. But until then, I hope that y'all have a good one.